Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about how things have really kind of changed with sports and hot takes and how they've evolved. So there was a video I was watching here that got reposted on X/Twitter. I still consider it to be Twitter. X just sounds dirty, but the post was by Jay Fresh showing Sid Sixero back in 2015, basically just declaring that Crosby was done, that Sidney Crosby was overrated, and of course, if you're Canadian, you've likely heard other bad hot takes from Sid Sixero. Now, Sid, I didn't always agree with him. I didn't often agree with him, to be honest. And I always had this feeling in the back of my mind. And I always have this feeling in the back of my mind when I see some of these hot takes. Does this person really believe this? And it's always there. So I'll start at the bottom of the board here. It does feel like there's a devil's advocate just for the sake of it. And I do my best not to do that. So if a player gets off to a slow start, I'll talk about it. I'll say, yeah, this player isn't looking very good. Definitely when I do my recap review videos. And just heads up, I'm probably going back to calling them the reviews. So previews and reviews. It just sounds better. And so it's going to go back to previews and reviews. But I don't say this guy clearly isn't any good this year. This player clearly doesn't have it. And even if I do a video talking about slow starts, I will say, hopefully they pick it up soon. And I mean that. But there are times where I feel like somebody in media, on TV, on radio, or on podcasts, will take that devil's advocate role. And I find myself thinking, okay, wait a minute. Do they actually mean this, or are they just being contrarian for the sake of contrarian? Because if you're contrarian, so again, going back to the hot take on Sidney Crosby, well, that's going to go viral. Everybody's going to talk about it. In 2015, Sidney Crosby was still the best player in the National Hockey League. And so what better way to get attention than to say I think the best player in the league is washed up. He's done. They're really, it sadly works, and it does what it's intended to do. So I do always have that thought in the back of my mind. And with Sid, when I was watching Tim and Sid, and I watch Tim and Sid all the time, this channel in part, because I'd watch Tim and Sid and I'd go, well, I want to talk about that. I should just do a video. I'll just talk to nobody. Who's going to watch a video I make? Anyways, so devil's advocate just for the sake of it, I think gets done. And I think it happens in the media. I think it happens a lot. Now, one thing, and we'll get into the others, but there's some hot takes that I don't get into, starting with, insert name of player is done. This gets thrown around a lot. It would be easy for me right now to say Patrick Kane, coming off of a season where his points total was down, he's coming off hip surgery, he's done. Be easy for me to stand here in videos and say it doesn't matter where he goes, he's no good anymore, he's done. You have, with a player coming out of hip surgery, a chance of being right about that. And having that hot take absolutely come out true. And then you turn around and you go, see? There you go. But that's just because the history of hip surgeries says a player is potentially going to be limited in their effectiveness at the very least going forward and maybe unable to keep up with the NHL game at worst, right? So it's one of those things that I'm not going to say, and I'll say straight out, I wouldn't say that about Patrick Kane because he's already shown what he'll fight through. He has already shown that he can get through adversity, and I wouldn't bet against him. So I'm not going to stand here and say that a player is necessarily done. And of course, I've talked about this before. I'll just mention this here. So-and-so is a bust. I would expect Bedard is a bust post within the first 2 weeks of his starting to play, even if he's playing well. If he in his first 10 games puts up, say, 3 goals, 3 assists, there's going to be comments of, see, he's not that good. I don't know what people were talking about. I heard he was going to be the next McDavid. Well, clearly he's not going to replace Sidney Crosby as the best. He's not going to replace McDavid as the best player. And that conversation will be there. Then he'll score like 6 or 7 points over the next week. And all of a sudden those comments go away until the next time that he has a slow period of time where he's having a hard time scoring. And then they all come back. So I don't put a whole lot of interest in that. You don't hear a lot of that with the press or with podcasters, various other media, but player is done. That's definitely out there. And again, I've seen players labeled as busts who aren't and never were. This is one of my favorites. He's clearly not happy. So I'll go back to a favorite, which is JT Miller. JT Miller doesn't, you know if JT Miller's had a bad day as soon as he steps out on the ice. Because he's not afraid to curse and swear and throw things and whatever he needs to do. And so people will look at that and go, well, clearly he's not happy. And all I think is maybe his parking spot was taken. Maybe his locker was messed up. Maybe something happened coming into the building that just ticked him right off. You just don't know. And then he's out on the ice. He seems like a grumpy individual. And there's other hockey players that don't hide it well either. At certain points in Phil Kessel's career, he hasn't hidden how he's felt it well at all. And then right away the press will be like, well, he's clearly not happy. What is his problem? I don't know. I'd be irritated too if I was a hockey player and I just lost a big game and I got a bunch of microphones in my face. I might not be in a very good mood either. So when I hear a reporter asking, why are you so pissy? My answer is because you're asking a dumb question or because he doesn't feel like talking to you right now. It's not the end of the world if a hockey player is like, I don't want to talk to the press right now. I want to practice. I want to rest up. I've got to ice my knee. My shoulder's killing me. We just lost a big game. I don't need this goober in the front row that just wrote an article about what a loser I am to ask me questions about why my game's suffering because I know how he's going to spin it. So I totally get why players might get cranky or grumpy. And my favorite is, and of course, at this time of year, you're going into final years of contracts for a lot of players. The salary cap's going up. There's a lot of discussions about how much contracts are going to be worth. That a player clearly has signaled he wants out. Clearly, he wants out. Austin Matthews clearly wants out of Toronto. He's not re-signing. Why aren't they looking to trade him? He re-signs for 4 years, and the next comments are, well, Nylander's going to want out. Nylander, how much is Marner worth now? It is an endless cycle. It's an endless cycle I really don't get into, and it is one of the funniest things because it will pivot. So you're going to hear about any player who's on an expiring contract, whether or not they want out, and people try to use body language, which is not a good indicator of whether or not they want out. Like for me personally, when I'm not on camera, I'm going to look miserable 90% of the time. I am not very approachable, and yet it's just that's how it is. You want to call it resting face, you can, and insert whatever swear word you want. It's, yeah, sure. But it's there. And so people would see me out and they'd be like, well, clear, isn't that the hockey guy? He looks mad. What do you think's going on with him and his wife? His wife looks happy. She's clearly oblivious. He's miserable. So again, you do that with you can do that, I guess with celebrities. You could do that with hockey players. You could do that with coaches. Anybody. You could have a coach behind the bench who's just watching this game and they're like, man, I'm ticked off, and it could be something completely different. Shows behind the bench because they don't hide it very well, and there you go. So we can call it resting JT Miller face, I guess, but it is interesting to me that people will then, well, he signaled he wants out, can be he hasn't signed a contract. He's talked about he's not re-signing yet, unless a player or the agent comes out publicly and says, yeah, it doesn't look like this is going to work. I don't consider it to be clearly signaled he wants out. Calgary's a good example. So we're in Calgary. You've got Hanifin, you've got Lindholm. All they've said is they're not likely to, basically hinted they're not likely to re-sign with the Flames. Hanifin reportedly saying, nah, probably not. But there's still a full year of play, and that can change things. It's definitely something that has happened before, where players, final year of their contract, probably hemming and hawing going into that season, they have a great year and they're like, man, I can't imagine playing anywhere else. So there's two ways to look at it, and the media will choose. And again, you get into podcasts, you get into various media, including here on YouTube, and you're going to have, well, this player clearly wants out. And that'll be the narrative right up until that player re-signs. How many times have we seen a player's going to re-sign? They're going to stay, and then they don't. Or vice versa. Well, clearly they're going to leave, and then they stay. So until something happens, it is mere speculation, and we don't know. We're not that player. There are reports I've had thrown at me from people on players and who is or isn't happy, and very often it doesn't match up with what the media is saying because it hasn't got out to the media that this player is actually not happy and this player is actually pretty happy and they're not going anywhere. So again, I can't throw that into a news video because then I'm getting into all that rampant speculation too, so I'm not going to do that. But it is something that can get definitely blown out of proportion. One of my favorites, and I love to see this early in the season, is so-and-so is a Vezina favorite. And I'm using Vezina as an example because it's really easy to look at a goalie who's through their first, say, 15 starts, got a 1.5 goals against, 940 save percentage, and say, well, he's the Vezina favorite, but it's a bit early. It's a bit early, It's a bit early to declare somebody a trophy favorite. Art Ross, you might get away with because McDavid could be 30 points ahead of the second in competition within a month of the season, and you can pretty accurately say, I think he's got the Art Ross not locked down. I think that's his now. Sort of like when he decided, I think it's time to score goals because I'd like a Rocket Richard trophy on my mantle, and make it so. But the things that I've noticed, the patterns I've noticed. So I've talked about the Devil's Advocate just for the sake of it. I've also noticed the criticism of star players. So again, coming back to Sid talking about Crosby, and this is common. We've seen it with Ovechkin, we've seen it with Crosby, we've seen it with McDavid, we see it with Matthews. Again, I'm old enough to remember when there were criticisms of players like Gretzky, of Mario Lemieux, of Patrick Waugh at times as well. And questions, and especially with goaltenders, you can take a goaltender that won a Stanley Cup, and 2 years later, if they've been eliminated in the first round 2 years in a row and their stats are iffy in those two eliminations, you can say, well, clearly he's not a playoff goaltender. It's not that long ago that Marc-Andre Fleury was seen as not necessarily being great in the playoffs for Pittsburgh, and that maybe the Penguins needed to make a change. And then they won back-to-back cups, and people kind of were sad that he ended up going to Vegas, some of the same people who would have criticized his play just years prior, and not that many years either. So the criticism of star players there, one thing that I try not to do, so I will cover losing streaks and winning streaks. I try not to overblow how important those are. So if a team has a 10-game winning streak, I will do the video on the winning streak. 10-game losing streak, same thing. But I'll also try to add in, and here's their upcoming schedule. Here's where it could fall apart, or here's where they could turn it around. And not to make it sound like, well, the season's done. Or, well, clearly major changes need to be made. It is one of my favorites when a team is on a 5 or 6 game losing streak and you'll see the headlines of, clearly this team has to make a major change. And people just overreacting. Teams go through rough patches. Teams go through really good moments as well. And an 82-game schedule, it's a long time. So, as I always say, people need to pace themselves. So when I'm seeing these comments in mid-October, late October of, well, this team's done, this player's finished, I will usually just leave a comment of, maybe try to pace yourself. It's still early. Might be a little bit early to declare that everything's awful or everything's fantastic. Just to try to keep things even keel. And one thing, too, that I've seen many, many times over is people labeling any player they don't like or players that they don't like as soft. As if every single team that wins the Stanley Cup does so with 20 guys who are 6'5", 240 pounds of solid muscle. They beat everybody up. They've never lost a fight, and every single one of them is from Saskatchewan. Like, this is just, teams aren't built that way, and now somebody's going to be like, I'm doing that in NHL 24. I've got, let's see, all from Saskatchewan. But that's not really generally. People are on their phones. What are you doing that with your keyboard for, stupid hockey guy? But the reality is that there are soft players who've won Stanley Cups, and there are some of the toughest SOBs you'll ever meet that haven't. And so the idea that, well, this guy's soft, so that's the problem, it is such a vague term. You can label a guy as soft who throws hits. If you say, well, he throws hits, but he won't fight, so he's soft. Well, yeah, he throws hits, but in the big game, he didn't throw any hits, so he was soft in that game. Or, yeah, I mean, he's a tough player, but did you see the way he took that hit and he was injured? He's soft. That hit shouldn't have hurt him. So that's a label you can throw at almost any player you don't like. In that moment, you can label them as soft. You could even say, well, he dropped the gloves and picked a fight, but that was such a minor hit. He's really soft because, honestly, he should have just got up from that hit and skated the other way. So it is the most overused terminology in hockey. It is one of the most ridiculous things in hockey, but it's also in sports. You see that with other sports too. Players just labeled as soft. It is this really just nebulous thing that you can't 100% qualify, but you can just throw it at a player and it sticks. And then you move along. And you're like, hey, I won that argument because I told him that his favorite player was soft and he didn't have an answer. Because it's a nebulous term and it doesn't really mean anything. Because you can point out, well, in the playoffs, because if the guy answers with, well, during the regular season, he did all of this. Yeah, but in the playoffs. Okay. And so again, that is something that's been out there a long time. But it is weird because there are guys who have 5, 6 Stanley Cup rings that weren't hard players, 6'5", 250 pounds from, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and they win Stanley Cups. So it really, hockey is a team sport. If you don't have a good team, you're not going to win championships. You're going to have a mix of players who are skilled. You're going to have some tough guys there. You're going to have that sandpaper. You have to have the right leadership. You have to have goaltending in key moments. That's basically what it takes for the Stanley Cup. And because, again, I don't have it on the board, but I should have, that there's this magical formula to Stanley Cup winners. There really isn't. I've talked about it before. There really isn't. Although teams that try to trade for and use free agency to build a Stanley Cup winner generally don't work. Usually it's they build from within and they build that chemistry and they keep those players together. And while Las Vegas could be seen as a team that didn't do that, those Golden Misfits played major roles in getting them over the hump this year in the playoffs. So Vegas may be an exception to that on some level, but they got the key goaltending when they needed it. They were hot at the right time, and they got key contributors from longtime Vegas Golden Knights. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What is your favorite hot take that people throw out there that doesn't age well? Let me know your thoughts. In my case, it was usually the draft. That's why now, all these years later, I have so many different services, draft services, prospect, scouting services that I use for draft videos. Because, yeah, I was clueless 6 years ago. Now I make sure that I know a little bit more about what I'm talking about with prospects and draft picks, because that's important for me to bring the information to all you fine people on the internet. But there are times where I will have a take that doesn't age well, and that's okay too. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.